John chapter 6, and we'll be around verses 25 to 60 today. It's a pretty significant passage. It's a passage that I bet you are familiar with because it is the only place, to my knowledge, that Jesus refers to himself as the very bread of life. And interestingly enough, this passage also takes place after the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is a very significant event in all four Gospels. I know we talked about that briefly in Matthew's take on that, the Gospel of Matthew. But we're looking at it from John's perspective. Because after John mentions the feeding of the 5,000, we do have the disciples get in the boat and cross across the sea into the land of Capernaum. But there's this different thing that happens. What happens after the feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of John is that everyone chases after Jesus. And when they realize that Jesus is gone, they get in their boats and they take off and they land in Capernaum right beside him, looking for him. And Jesus has a very interesting response on them following him. You would think that Jesus would be all excited that they followed him. Jesus says, "You came after me just to see what else I would do for you." Jesus just fed them. Jesus implies you came after me for another free meal. The pull of food is something that is strong in our culture. If you don't believe me, look at all of the restaurants as you drive through town. There are restaurants everywhere. And I show that food and I have had a good relationship. Maybe not a healthy relationship, but a good tie. And this concept of Jesus being the bread of life is something that I think we can really relate to. Because we understand what it is like to eat. That is something that has never changed. People have to eat in order to survive, right? It had to happen in Jesus' day. It happens now. And I was thinking about this and how integral our kitchens are in our home. If you watch any of the HGTV stuff or any of the home remodeling stuff, they usually put thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, into remodeling their kitchens. And even as I look at our kitchen, we spend a lot of time, and I was thinking about this, and over the years I've come across some pretty good signs that you can hang in your kitchen. And so I went through it and I Googled and I found and compiled a top 10 list for you today of the top 10 list signs that you can hang in your kitchen. I don't know that you'd want to, but you could if you were looking. So here's number 10. If we are what we eat, then I'm easy, fast, and cheap. Number 9, thou shalt not weigh more than thy refrigerator. Number 8, my next house will have no kitchen, just vending machines. Number 7, and I love this one, I think Allie would love this one, a balanced diet is a cookie in each hand. Number 6 has happened to me, and I didn't know this was a real word, snacksident. It's a noun, snacksident. That is eating an entire box of chocolate, a dozen cupcakes, a batch of cookies, a whole pizza, or a family-sized bag of chips by mistake. Snacksident. So if that happens, there you go. Now you know the word for that. Number 5, love is in the air, or is that bacon? Number 4, this would be Alex's. There is nothing peanut butter and a spoon can't fix. Number 3, my favorite thing to make for dinner is reservations. And number 2, if you're not supposed to have midnight snacks, why is there a light in the fridge? And number 1, and I think if we're honest, this is maybe the problem, but number 1, I followed my heart, it led me to the fridge. These sayings point to some of our society's attitudes about food, even our attitudes about food. That only junk food is really enjoyable. That food is meant to satisfy us. If I had to cook it, it doesn't taste as good. And as long as it's not good for me, I should eat as much as I want. Limit the vegetables, limit the fruit, but if it's not good for me, as much as I want. We stuff ourselves, trying to fill the hole inside each one of us with food. It's as if we could eat something that would satisfy us. We could eat something that would fill us up and make us feel complete. It's almost as if we could stuff ourselves at every meal, but we will always be hungry for something deeper. And that's what we need to hear going into this passage in John, because Jesus has just performed the miracle of feeding the 5,000. They had an amazing meal at Jesus' hands, and they go after him for more. And his response isn't what you'd anticipated. So John chapter 6, verse 25. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" In other words, Jesus, we never saw you leave. We never saw you disappear, or we'd have just come with you. That was really good for dinner for yesterday. We didn't see you leave. But Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth, you are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." If there is ever an ouch statement from Jesus, that's it. You're not coming after me because of what you saw. You're coming after me because of what you got out of it. Because you stuffed your bellies. Verse 27, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Then they ask him, what must we do to do the works God requires? Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." So they ask him, "What miraculous sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our forefathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus said to them, "I tell you the truth, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "from now on, give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me and still do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day." At this the Jews began to grumble about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." They said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I came down from heaven'?" "Stop grumbling among yourselves," Jesus answered. "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at that last day. It is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who listens is to the Father and learns from him comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. I tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" Jesus said to him, "I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is the real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever." He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. In verse 60. On hearing it, many of the disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" And if you were to read on, many of them leave. In fact, Jesus will turn to the disciples, the 12, and say, "Do you want to leave too?" Because it's a very hard teaching. We know what it is like to be hungry and to eat physical bread, and for that to stop our stomach from rumbling. We know what it is like to be thirsty and to take a drink of water or coffee or hot chocolate or soda or whatever you might like, and to feel it quench some of that thirst. But the thought of eating something that is not physical bread or physical drink is really hard to comprehend. In fact, if you listen, they struggled all the way through. They were really hoping that Jesus was just giving them some teaching, saying something, and then he was going to do what he had done before and bring bread from what seemed like there was nothing, not enough to feed. I have a feeling that the meal that Jesus fed to the 5,000 was wonderful. I have a feeling that it was some of the best bread and fish that they had ever had because people went after them. People went after Jesus and the disciples. It made an impression. I have some good cooks in my family. I love it when they cook, and I remember many of their meals because they leave an impression. Not only here, it stays with you. And I think that the bread that Jesus fed the crowd that day was the best they'd ever had. Do you know that story, that miracle story, and the passion narrative of Jesus' death and crucifixion and resurrection, which is really the heart of the gospel, are the only two that are in all four gospels? That's the impression that this miracle story of feeding the multitude had. You would think that Jesus' birth would be in all four. It's not. Matthew and Luke. Mark and John don't tell us anything about Jesus' birth. You would think that maybe it would be something else, but it is this feeding of the multitude and Jesus' passion narrative that all four Gospels include. It tells us that what occurred that day was really special. It was something that really impacted the community, that stuck with them until the Gospels were written down, because they weren't written just as Jesus did everything. They were written sometime later. It was a meal that they never forgot, and they wanted another one. And Jesus didn't do it. You have to wonder why. I mean, if it was that good, why didn't Jesus do it again? Surely he could have, without question. Yet he chose not to. He chose to take that moment and to say what you thought was good fails in comparison to who I really am, and to what I can really do in your life. It's a hard teaching. It's hard to understand. It's hard to accept because we know what it is like for our physical bellies to rumble. But I think you have to be paying attention to hear your spiritual belly rumble. Often we confuse the spiritual rumbling with the physical. Have you ever found yourself wanting to eat, yet nothing looked good, and you weren't really hungry, but you wanted something? I have a hunch that maybe that was more of a spiritual rumbling. Or maybe that was an emotional rumbling, and you were trying to do something to calm that uncomfortableness. And Jesus is trying to help them understand that you will never fix yourself with food. They laid on the compliment. They called him rabbi because they really thought that he would do what they wanted. And the moment that Jesus does not respond, they thought he would. How did they refer to him? Isn't this Joseph and Mary's boy? Did you catch the change? They come onto the scene. Oh, Rabbi, we are ready for your message. We are ready to hear and to receive what you have for us today. I hope it's as good as yesterday. And when Jesus doesn't deliver, literally, they say, isn't this Joseph and Mary's boy? The one who lived down the street. How can he say that he came from heaven? What is going through his mind? I think as we look at this passage, there's some questions that we need to ask ourselves whenever we are approaching Jesus. The crowd came over expecting Jesus to feed them again. They came over expecting another miracle. They came over expecting something equal or better than what they had before. And I think it's a fair question to say, what are we looking for when we go to Jesus? If you're writing notes, there's a nice spot in your bulletin that you can do that. Actually, the back cover. It's a question I'd love for you to write down. What are we looking for from Jesus? They were looking for another free meal. And if we are honest, sometimes that's what we're looking for too. We go to Jesus and say, Jesus, I have this problem. Here you go. Jesus, I know that you can work miracles. I know that you've done this before. Here you go. Oh, Jesus, please don't let the dozen cookies that I ate affect my waistline. My pants are tight already. Oh, Jesus, please pay my bills when I spent extravagantly. Oh, Jesus, please fix this because I got myself in trouble. What are we looking for? The crowd came after Jesus. They searched for him. They got in boats and went where he was. You think Jesus would be impressed? I mean, you think so, right? They came after him. He's not impressed at all. He's not excited to see them. Instead, it seems like Jesus is almost annoyed in this passage because they came after him not to see him, but to see what he could do for them. But if you were to think for a brief moment, you can think of people in your life like that. People who come to see you when they need something. People who are best friends with you the moment they have a need. I have noticed that with a pickup truck, I have a lot of friends. I'm excited. Pastor Brian now has a truck. But we know what this is like. We have people in our life who only come around when they need something. And that's exactly what the crowd was doing to Jesus. And if we are honest with ourselves, we do it too. We forget about Jesus while everything is going great. We forget about Jesus while our bellies are full, or while we are distracted, or while we are busy doing this. And the moment we sense a little bit of uncomfortableness, we run to Jesus and say, Jesus, would you fix this? And I don't think that he's always impressed, because he wasn't impressed here. Boy, that's a hard teaching, isn't it? It's not something that we necessarily like or feel good about. But sometimes we are looking for Jesus because of what he can do for us. One thing that I think we often miss about the disciples is that they were with Jesus even when he wasn't performing miracles or ministering. We don't talk much about that. We look at the disciples, we look at the things that they did, we look how they acted, we look how they grew, we look how they changed, or how they sacrificed and gave up their vacation to go with Jesus. We even look to see what they did throughout the rest of the New Testament, to see how they acted after Jesus ascended to heaven. But we miss the fact that the disciples lived in community with Jesus, whether it was a miracle or a non-miracle day. Whether it was a major teaching moment or it wasn't. They lived in community with Jesus. They saw parts of Jesus that the crowd never did. I will guarantee that they laughed together. We know from Scripture that they wept together at the death of Lazarus. They lived in community. And think about this. The people that we share our lives with know us better than anyone else. And there was this major distinction between the disciples being with Jesus all the time and the crowd coming in boats saying, Jesus, I'm ready for dinner. when we start to put it into that perspective, suddenly I want to be less identified with the crowd. But to be less identified with the crowd and more identified as a disciple, then there's going to have to be a distinctive change. If the only time I go to Jesus is when I need something, then I'm like the crowd. But if we want to be like the disciples and living in community with Jesus, then it's got to be a day in and day out thing. A reminder that even when Jesus doesn't just meet the need that we have, when Jesus just doesn't do what we wanted, we don't turn and leave him. We still stay in community with him. That means we're thinking about Jesus 24/7. That's a huge change from the way we normally do church in America. We do church in America on Sunday mornings, maybe Saturday nights, maybe Sunday evening nights, or Sunday evenings. And when we have a crisis, that's how we do Christianity. What Jesus modeled was something totally different. What the disciples lived was totally different. And I'm convinced that it's what Jesus is looking for in us. So the first question is, what are we looking for? And if you have your bulletins out, I want you to write the second question down. Because I think it helps us answer the first question. It takes us to maybe another step. But what satisfies us? What are we looking for from Jesus is the first one. The second one is, what satisfies us? What's it mean to be satisfied? We're pleased, we're happy, we're content. We don't want anything. And we're told in our culture that we should never be satisfied. That we should always have something bigger and better that we're going for. Always going for that next thing up. That we want to have stuff that's better than the person beside us. That we should always keep looking for what we can aspire to do or to achieve or to gain. And Jesus clearly seems to shoot that down from the crowd as they were coming to him for that. What satisfies us? Now this is very clearly not Jesus telling us not to be lazy. This is not a statement saying, hey, don't work, just depend on what comes your way. I don't think that's it at all. This is not telling us not to work or to sit back or to not care or to not do a good job. It's a different message. It is Jesus telling the crowd and the disciples that no bread or no earthly thing will ever satisfy them completely. There is a big difference between don't try and realizing that no earthly thing will satisfy us. If we don't work, it's tough to eat, right? If we don't work, it's tough to pay our bills, right? If we don't have some source of income, it's very difficult to do the things that we need to do. And so Jesus isn't just saying sit back and don't do anything, but he's saying understand that the pursuit of things, the pursuit of material goods, the pursuit of always the next meal will not satisfy you. It can't. I never realized how much of a focus we had on food until I had 2 kids. And I would love to say that I help all the time with dinner. I try. If you want an honest answer, ask Jen. She'll tell you how much I do help. Or maybe how much I don't. But I do try. And I am very honest here that I've had way more hot meals in the past 5 years than Jen has. But I do try. It seems like morning to evening is one non-stop meal. We eat, we clean up. And by the time I have cleaned up, guess what time it is? It's time to eat. And I might think that Alex is done and I'm ready to clean up, and he's like, no! And he eats again. We eat, we clean up, we wait, we eat again. And tomorrow we do it all again. There is this constant reminder that we need this food in our life, that we need this stuff. And so when Jesus says that we can be satisfied by an eternal bread, it's really tough to comprehend, because it doesn't match anything else in our worldview. It doesn't match what the media and advertisements say, but it also doesn't match our experience. And it doesn't always match the way we feel. Thinking about this, I was realizing over the years some of the things that I have done to make myself feel better when I just really wanted to be satisfied. I've got a long list. I bet if you're honest with yourself, you'd have a long list too. One of my favorites, other than food, was buying cars. Not a good habit. Not a good habit. Fun, but it's like that fix will wear off quickly. Jesus says that the only thing that will really satisfy us is Him. The crowd came after Jesus because they had another need. They were hungry, and Jesus tells them that only He can satisfy. And their response in verse 41 is perfect. And I think we do the exact same thing with Jesus. Verse 41. At this, the Jews began to grumble about Him because He said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can we now say, I came down from heaven? We get just as angry with Jesus when He doesn't meet our needs as the crowd did that day. We get just as frustrated with Jesus when Jesus doesn't do what we think He should as the crowd did that day. And we grumble. I've had this need and I prayed and prayed and prayed, and can you believe, as much as I prayed, that God didn't fix it? Now, we don't often want to talk about that in church, but I have grumbled when God didn't do what I wanted. And not only have I grumbled to myself, but I've grumbled to some close friends. I said, can you believe that God didn't do this? The crowd was grumbling, and although we have their official response right there, you better believe they were talking to one another. What? Can He do it? Was this just a one-time thing? They were really upset. And Jesus challenges them with something that they never anticipated. And it's something that I think that at times we don't anticipate. And so I want to ask it. It's the third question. Have you tasted the living bread? Have you tasted the living bread, the true bread? Because Jesus says that every other thing we eat, even the manna that came down from heaven, the manna that God supplied to the Israelites as they were in Exodus, as they were in the wilderness, even that did not lead to eternal life. They died even after eating manna. Everything else will allow us to die. Whether it is the miraculous bread at the feeding of the 5,000, or the manna that appeared with the dew in the morning, the only thing that lasts is Jesus. So how do we know if we've tasted it? Boy, that's a tough one. It starts in how we approach Jesus. If we are approaching Jesus like the crowd did that day, just looking for what Jesus is going to do next, guess what? We really haven't. If we're going to Jesus and just saying, Jesus, okay, you fixed this, now I want you to fix this, and I want you to fix that, then chances are we are in the same boat as the crowd. Maybe not literally the same boat, but the same scenario as the crowd that day, where we are just expecting Jesus to perform miracles and to fix our problems. If, however, we find ourselves more like the disciples, and Jesus is in our heart and on our mind throughout the day, the way perhaps our spouse is, or our best friend, or our bellies, or the need that we currently have at this moment, then the chances are that we've had a taste of the true bread. Because it is in our life to the point that it is permeating our thoughts and actions. Jen and I just had this conversation this weekend. We had a wonderful week, as hard as it was with the Color Dash being canceled. We had a wonderful week together. She was on vacation. We spent a lot of time doing family stuff together, and by Friday evening, we had enough family stuff together. And we needed some adult time together. And so we had someone come over to stay with the kids, and we were gone. And it was very difficult not to pack a bag and to go, because we were that ready. And we were having the conversation of how things had changed in the past several years. We've been in our home for 10 years, which is hard to believe. This November we've been married 11 years. And that may not be long to some of you, but on my end it feels like it was just yesterday. I remember the stuff that happened. I remember some of the intense conversations that happened. And one of them was that my house that I lived in as a bachelor was not the cleanest. It was a bachelor pad. And although there were dirty dishes in the sink, there were also piles of pizza boxes next to it. Main food source. It worked out really well. I know the people at Domino's and Pizza Hut very well. And I've had the opportunity to minister to them through over the years. So outreach event, if you want to phrase it that way. But she would say, honey, you're not going to live like this when we're married, are you? Oh no. Oh no. Well, shortly after getting married, it came to a crash. It was either learn to pick up, or this is going to be rough. And I was saying, honey, aren't you impressed? 11 years now, I make the bed. I make the bed. Granted, sometimes it's 5 minutes before Jen gets home. But I make the bed. I help with the vacuum cleaner. I help with the kids. And it's amazing the fact that I like to see stuff neat and clean when it didn't bother me before. Because Jen has really permeated my world. She changed me in ways that I didn't even know I needed to be changed or think that I should be changed. Tasting the true bread does that to us on a spiritual level. It changes us. We look back and say, I'm no longer the Christian that I was, because God has had this hold on my heart. He's changed things in me that I didn't even realize that I changed, and now I can't imagine going back. God has changed the way I treat people. Instead of just being selfish and looking out for my own needs, I actually care about others. Instead of just trying to get through stop signs as fast as I can, I occasionally wait and give someone else that chance to go. Instead of pushing through the store, I let others go ahead. Instead of making sure that just my needs are met, think about where someone else is at. This true bread changes the way we are. And instead of just going to the fridge every time I'm uncomfortable, or instead of buying a new car every time I feel depressed, or instead of going shopping every time my clothes don't fit because I've been too much time at the fridge, I get real with God. That's what the true bread does in our life, and that's just a small picture. Think of the ways your best friends, your spouse, your children, if you have them, have impacted your life, and multiply it, because that's what God does when we really let Him in. It's every area. Nothing is left alone. And so Jesus, in this moment of saying to the crowd, I want to give you something that is better, they couldn't hear it or receive it because it didn't match what they were looking for. And so I want you to hear this today. If you're going to Jesus and just saying, Jesus, meet my need, you're going to miss something much better than you can even imagine. I'm not saying that it's wrong to ask Jesus to meet our need. It is absolutely good and true and correct to pray for that. But to not base our love for Jesus on His decision to meet our need. Does that make sense today? So God's abundant provision. God supplies way more than we could ever ask or think that we need. The question is it what we want? I'm going to ask that you would just begin to bow your heads and close your eyes. And I want you to take a moment and stay right here. Ask yourself the questions, what am I looking for? What is it that will satisfy me? And have I really tasted the true bread? And I want you to lift those questions up to God.